Good afternoon and welcome to Webinar Wednesday. We're excited to have over 640 registered attendees for today's webinar, which is eligible for 1 credit from the ACI. Let's get started by giving one lucky attendee a Webinar Wednesday t-shirt for answering this trivia question. June is National Aquarium Month. Where is the largest aquarium in the US? Answer now using the questions feature on your dashboard. While you're answering, I just want to remind everyone that if you've missed any of our previous webinars, you can watch them on our website, webinarwednesday.live, and still receive a CEE credit as well, as long as the webinar has been within the last 12 months. Also, just a reminder that the Schedule MD Expo Irvine has been replaced with 3 smaller regional HTM mixers. We understand that the COVID-19 pandemic poses unique challenges for everyone, and we're committed to doing our part in restoring conferences to the HTM community. We understand that participants may be hesitant or unable to travel, so by providing local regional conferences, we'll be able to provide valuable continuing education, networking, and vendor engagement opportunities in a significantly modified, smaller, shorter duration, less crowded, and safer environment. So please join us in Colorado, August the 19th and 20th, Wisconsin in October 1st and 2nd, and California, December 9th and 10th. Registration is now open for the Colorado Mixer, so for more information, visit htmmixer.com. Okay, let's see who the winner of our Webinar Wednesday t-shirt is, and it is Carol Burke. Congratulations, Carol. Of course, the correct answer is Atlanta here in Georgia. Webinar Wednesday would like to thank our sponsor, Fluke Biomedical. Fluke Biomedical is the premier global provider of test and measurement equipment and services to the healthcare industry. They serve biomedical engineers, quality assurance technicians, medical physicists, oncologists, radiation safety professionals, and are continually expanding their range of solutions to a broader range of health and safety professionals. Learn more at flukebiomedical.com. Our presenter today is Jerry Zion, Global Training Manager at Fluke Biomedical. Jerry, as always, you may begin whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Linda. Hi, everybody. Thanks for taking time out of your day to listen to our webinar, and I hope that you'll have something meaningful that you walk away with. So let's start about non-invasive blood pressure monitor testing. So what we're going to cover is blood pressure in review. What is it? Monitoring non-invasive blood pressure and NIBP performance testing, including accuracy. So blood pressure, just to review, and because some of you have taken this as part of your anatomy and physiology courses, if you were trained in a university or college or sometimes in a trade school scenario, or at the Department of Defense schoolhouse, you will have learned this. Others of you are coming from other industries, so it's appropriate for us to review it. Blood pressure is measured whenever you go to the emergency room as part of the triage to help figure out who needs to be treated most urgently. It's part of what gets done when you go and visit your doctor in your doctor's office. And it's definitely something that's monitored if you're admitted to the hospital for any reason. So what is it? It is measured using, usually non-invasively, using a cuff and some way to pressurize that cuff and a way to listen or otherwise determine the pressure levels and what's going on in the cuff, usually and most typically as the cuff deflates. There are other technologies we'll talk about in a little bit. It's specified as systolic pressure over diastolic pressure. So what is the systolic? The systolic pressure is the pressure in the arteries when the heart ventricles contract and push the blood out of the heart. That's the systolic pressure. Diastolic pressure is the pressure in the arteries when the heart refills. So once the heart is refilled with blood just before the next contraction, that's the diastolic pressure. So we look at that, and usually we'll talk about the ranges, normal ranges and so forth in a minute. but we express this as 120 millimeters of mercury over 80 millimeters of mercury. Units of measure can vary. It can be pascals, or it can be also in some other ways of expressing. But millimeters of mercury was traditionally the way that it is expressed, because it was actually measured using a column of mercury as our measurement tool to assess and see what the pressure value was. So here are some of the ranges of blood pressure based on the peer review and our history of assessing blood pressure over the many years that it has been measured. So 120/80 is considered normal. There's a range of normalness. 120 to 129 over less than 80, you're kind of elevated but not high blood pressure yet. But if your systolic is 130 to 139 or your diastolic is 80 to 89, now you're in the high blood pressure category, and the doctor should be looking at some other things and making some assessments to diagnose what's going on, why your blood pressure is elevated. If your blood pressure is greater than 140 millimeters of mercury or systolic, or greater than 90 millimeters of mercury diastolic, then you have a very high blood pressure, and you will probably be admitted immediately to the hospital one way or another to determine why your blood pressure is so very high. So those just give you a kind of an idea in human physiology, kind of what kind of range you might be falling in. Most of us are going to be in the healthy, normal blood pressure category. So high blood pressure can damage the blood vessels, and it's not limited only to heart attacks and heart failure. Strokes, kidney failure, and other peripheral vascular disease can also be part of the cause. And actually, it can be tied up with things like type 2 diabetes and obesity are all playing together around in this space. So your blood pressure may be elevated because you're carrying too much body fat, your weight is up too much. So there are a lot of different reasons why we assess blood pressure and try and keep track of it. There are a couple of different ways to measure blood pressure. The old manual way, in this case you see the picture on the left, has something called an aneroid sphygmomanometer. It's a analog pressure gauge that is calibrated from 0 to 300 millimeters of mercury. And this is the next thing newer than the column of mercury that was used in the place of the aneroid gauge. So it was used to see what the systolic pressure was as accurately and exactly as we could on a gauge, and the systolic as well. The way it was used is you inflate the blood pressure cuff to block the flow of blood in the limb. So you're listening while you're inflating, and when you no longer hear blood flow sounds, now you know that you have enough pressure in the cuff to cut off flow in that blood vessel. Then you listen for the Korotkoff sounds, and there are two of them. The one you're listening for is as you slowly deflate the cuff, what is the pressure at which you first begin to hear the first Korotkoff sounds, which are the indication that blood is beginning to flow, and it's pulsatile. And so you're listening for that Korotkoff sound. You're going to continue to deflate the cuff until you no longer hear any more sounds, which means the blood vessel is now wide open again and blood is flowing. So there's no There's no more pulsations. You're not going to hear anything new. The first sound is the systolic. The second sound is the diastolic. And you will calculate the mean arterial blood pressure from those two measured values. That's how auscultatory blood pressure is determined. All right, so now we move to, well, what happens if you don't have your hands free? You need your hands to do something else. What do you do now? Well, enter technology into the picture. The next thing is an oscillometric automatic blood pressure measurement device. The first ones, and for a very long time, all of them were deflationary. That is, they work very similar to the way that you inflate the cuff and release the cuff when you're doing the auscultation. But in this case, it works a little bit differently in oscillometry. In the case of oscillometry, what we're doing is the technology is sensing the peak pressure in the cuff. And we hope we get the right peak pressure. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But once we get the peak pressure in the cuff, as the cuff slowly deflates step by step, it's a stepwise deflation. So it looks like a little staircase going downward from the peak pressure down to when there's to the lower pressure. The blood flow is present but restricted initially. And what we actually get is we get a mean arterial pressure, and then the technology calculates the systolic and diastolic from there. So it's just kind of the opposite from when you auscultate the blood pressure. So it's very possible for the systolic and diastolics to be a little bit different between the two ways of making the measurement. And assuming that you're making the measurement, listening, and doing the oscillometry on the same limb at the same time. Because here's the other thing you got to understand. Human physiology is quite variable. From moment to moment, your blood pressure is different. It's different from one limb than another limb. So if I'm having my automated blood pressure device on my left arm and I'm trying to auscultate a reading on my right arm, those are two completely different readings, two completely different measurements, and they will produce two completely different values. And they are not appropriate to compare one against the other. They're not apples to apples at all, not in any way. So if I have a clinician who says, look, that automated device is obviously not making the measurement right, that's not what I measured on the other limb, I invite them to listen while the oscillometric technology does the pump up and deflation so that they can hear their Korotkov sounds happen as it would if they were inflating the cuff themselves and deflating it. And almost always that settles the issue. Why? Because it's the same measurement. We're listening while the oscillometric technology is doing its thing. We're coming up with our mean arterial pressure, and it will be much closer to agreement than it would otherwise be. So you don't want to try and compare one measurement against a different measurement in any respect, whether it's on an opposite limb but at the same time, or whether it's making the measurement with the oscillometric automated technology and then making a completely different measurement even on the same limb and auscultating it. None of those are apples to apples comparisons at all, and they will never produce the same result. So just so you keep that in mind. When we're talking about algorithms that are used, and I use the algorithm word, that term, very loosely here, because we don't know exactly what the firmware formulaic way of making the measurement is from one manufacturer, brand, and model to another. We don't really know that. And it's not disclosed to us in the service manual or anywhere else by that manufacturer. So what we have to do is understand that they're at a high level, a couple of different ways to approach this. And again, for the moment, we're going to remind ourselves that we're talking about deflationary oscillometry for sure. I'm not so sure about inflationary oscillometry. We'll talk about that. But the way that this is handled in deflationary oscillometry, which is automated NIBP, is a height method or a slope method. The height method is more of a statistical sample approach, but it's usually normalized to 100%, which means it's been manipulated and fudge factored in order to agree better with comparative auscultatory blood pressure measurements. And that's how they've come up with their formulaic way of managing a more accurate blood pressure reading in the firmware of the medical device. So again, the peak pressure in the cuff is assumed to be the mean arterial pressure, and then there's a calculation, a statistical calculation of diastolic and systolic pressure values. Okay, so it's that's the way that it's done. It's more of a statistical sample method. The slope method, which has been used for a long time in a lot of different automated devices, is really more of a calculus way of doing things. So it's using a series of point slope measurements in order to come up with what is the systolic and what is the diastolic measurement value. Once again, the peak pressure in the cuff is assumed to be the mean arterial pressure. And then systolic and diastolic pressures are calculated, in this case using calculus, a point slope way of assessing what is the systolic and diastolic pressures compared to from the mean arterial pressure. So at a high level, that gives you a little bit of an understanding of what's going on. Once again, it's not disclosed specifically or dealt with specifically from any manufacturer that I have seen or that I know of. Well, so now let's talk about, are there global regulatory standards? There definitely are. There are local national standards, like in the United States, it's ANSI, which is American Association of the Association for Advancement of Medical Instrumentation, working along with the American National Standards Institute, ANSI. The standard is SP10. Internationally, we look at IEC 60601 umbrella. We're looking specifically at NIBP in the IEC 60601-2-30. And these are written and can be applied in the hospital, but really the first two bullet points that you see here under hospital biomeds and independent service organizations, the ISOs, is the manufacturer's specification for device performance, number one. Because the standards that I've just spoken about apply and are written for the manufacturer to follow, and they have to make measurements and prove in their design validation testing that their way of doing blood pressure measurements in this case is safe and effective for clinical use. And who is the judge of all of that? The United States FDA. And by the way, that doesn't matter where the manufacturing or design development site is in the world. If they expect to sell their product in the United States of America, they have to obtain at least a 510K clearance to market from the US FDA. And sometimes if there's no previous device to compare it to that's in the market already, they have to do a PMA, which is a brand new technology of any kind. you would have to do this. It's a very much longer process. You have to have a lot more clinical studies and so forth to go along with it. But just so you realize, clinical expectations of device performance play into the game, but it's really, what does the manufacturer say the specs and the device performance should be? And that's what we're going to be working with. The medical device manufacturers will test against international standards typically, because they're typically selling their product all around the world. And again, that's for design validation and sometimes also applied to final assembly testing in the factory just before that medical device is put in the box and shipped to you, the end user. All right, so here's a question that I have for you. How do you test NIBP devices for accuracy? And let me give you some distractors here. Here's our distractors. And Linda, you were going to have a special way for them to respond on this, right?
Yes, I will launch a poll for everyone to complete. So it will just give everybody a couple of seconds to place their vote. Okay, numbers are climbing. Okay, Jerry, I will close the poll and show. So we have 38% by doing a static pressure test, 60% by doing a dynamic simulator test, and 2% by performing a visual inspection.
Very good. Well, so very interesting and also very not unusual for the many times that we've gone through and are providing training about NIBP accuracy and measurement for patient monitor testing around the world over the last several years. I'm going to show you and talk to you about why the only way to assess accuracy in NIBP devices is by doing not just a static pressure test at one pressure level, but at several pressure levels. And most manufacturers that provide this, it's usually in their service manual testing procedure, will have more than one pressure level that you'll do the static pressure comparison. That's the only way, because in the dynamic simulation of blood pressure, there are too many variables that you cannot control all happening at the same time. Too much. In order to assess accuracy, it's got to be a single measurement in order to do anything about accuracy, because you've got to have your stack up of uncertainties of confidence that your measurement was indeed accurate. You have to have a transfer standard or a primary standard to be used as a comparison. That is something that is absolutely and accurate. It has been calibrated with traceability all the way to SI units of measure, all the way to that level. So the only way to assess accuracy, and it doesn't matter whether the technology is inflationary oscillometry or deflationary oscillometry, or even if it's that aneroid gauge that is used for doing auscultatory pressure assessment, the only way to assess accuracy is by static pressure level tests, period. Well, so what about the other two? Well, you should be performing a visual inspection every time that you assess that you're going to do periodically go and test the patient monitor, the NIBP device. You're going to do some leak tests on the cuff and the hose. You want to make sure that visually things are looking okay. That's fine. But again, that's not about accuracy of the NIBP device. It's about making sure the device is actually going to function properly to begin with. You have to do that before you do your accuracy assessment. Dynamic simulation is about repeatability and stability of the patient monitor measurement system, the whole system. It is not about accuracy. The dynamic simulation is not about accuracy. It's about other things. So our correct answer here is A, by doing static pressure tests. And those of you that have been doing dynamic simulation tests and thinking that you were testing accuracy, I'm sorry to inform you that that is not a correct way to think about it. You've been doing a type of testing that's necessary, but it's not about accuracy at all, not. Well, how do I know that? Well, again, we're talking about static pressure test versus dynamic, and the fact that you need to be able to control all of the variables and minimize, so you've only got one thing that you're focused on in order to get accuracy. So that's that. And then we've already talked about dynamic simulation. It's about repeatability and stability of the NIBP pressure measurement system in that patient monitor. This comes from guidance and actually a ruling from the International Order of International Order of Legal Metrology. And OIML is kind of out of sequence, and that's because it is the short term for the French description in the French language of the International Organization of Legal Metrology, but they are part of the SI units of measure guidance, and there's an international agreement with many nations signing on to this agreement about accuracy of the SI units of measure and making measurements in an accurate, repeatable, traceable way, so that if I make a measurement or have someone making an NIBP accuracy measurement in Singapore, it's the same measurement that I make and the same method that I use in the United States, in France, in the Eastern European nations, India, it doesn't matter. We know that we're making the same measurement and we can count on that measurement and sharing that measurement information. Without that, everybody's going to have their own standard of measurement, their own comparison, and we're going to be all over the map and nobody's going to be able to rely on anything. And the doctor needs to be able to rely on that blood pressure measurement from that automated blood pressure device, because they're going to diagnose their patient either for the first time or they're going to assess their care plan, the treatment that they're giving that patient, whether it's a medication they're delivering, fluids, whatever it is, based on the measurements that are made with that medical device. So I'm just going to ask you one question. How do you want that medical device to work under those circumstances if you or somebody you love is the next patient who will be connected to it? I'd say I want it to be accurate, and I want it to be measured for accuracy using an internationally recognized way of making that assessment. So that's what we're talking about here. Our guidance comes from the International Order of Legal Metrology, which sets the guidelines. All right. So when we go about trying to do static pressure level assessment, perhaps you've already noticed, maybe you've tried this, you find that you can't just connect up your pressurization device or your measurement device to the blood pressure measurement system and get it to hold a pressure. And that's because there's a pressure relief valve in that system that has a normal condition of being open. That means it's not closed. You cannot seal the pressure measurement system. And in order to do a static pressure test, you must be able to seal the measurement system. We call that the vessel, the pressure vessel. You've got to be able to seal it. Well, how can you do it then? Well, you need to have the service manual for that medical device, that blood pressure device, and you need to look in there in the testing and the calibration procedure for NIBP, and that is where you have the controls of that medical device to close the relief valve so that you can pressurize the system and hold it at a specific pressure level. And if you can't hold it at a pressure level, that tells you something else. It failed the test, and now the troubleshooting happens. You say, why did I have such a big leak when I sealed the relief valve? So we go from measurement and calibration to it failed, now I have to do a corrective action. All right, you with me? So the requirement here is that I must be able to seal the pressure relief valve, to close it. I have to be in the service mode usually in the NIBP calibration section to be able to do that. And once I'm able to do that, then I need to understand, in many cases, the patient monitor wants to be the pressurization control device. So in other words, we're not going to use our test instrument to do the pressurization of the system now. The patient monitor wants to do that, so we go ahead and let it. And now our measurement device, our test instrument, is going to be our transfer standard, having been and maintained in calibration. So that means you need to be making sure that your test instruments are calibrated typically at least once a year with a traceable calibration. And we're going to use our test instrument as a transfer standard, and this is our boss. What it says is what it is. Because it's accurate, we have a traceable calibration on it. And whatever the patient monitor thinks it is secondary, because it is the device under test. So our patient monitor may need to be the pressure source, that's fine. And then whatever it displays on its calibration screen is compared against what we see on our test instrument, and they should agree within whatever the accuracy specification claimed by the medical device manufacturer. It's their spec, it's their design. We're using our test instrument to make sure that what they said is what that medical device actually does. That's what we're doing. So we're going to do this comparison, and it's either within the tolerance or it's not. So it either passes or it fails. And if it fails, then we do a corrective action to figure out why. Is there an adjustment we can make to bring it into tolerance, or does it need to be repaired or replaced? Okay, so that's how we're going to assess the accuracy and what we're going to do with it. And it's really, really important. Repeatability is what we can use the dynamic simulation for. So it's not about accuracy at all. In no way is dynamic simulation about accuracy. It is about, if I send a signal or cause a pressurization to happen, let's say 120/80, that no matter what I see on the measurement system display, the NIBP display, as long as every time I send 120/80, it is the same, then it is repeatable. Has nothing to do with accuracy. Get accuracy out of your brain when it comes to this. It is about repeatability and stability. That's all it's about. And I need to do both ways of assessment in my workflow. And typically the manufacturer of the medical device will say that in their service manual test procedure as well. So we're going to look at accuracy separate from repeatability. We're going to look at other needs like leak tests. Is it able to hold a pressure? Things like that before we do either the accuracy or the repeatability test. Well, remember I said that sometimes the technology of the measurement system in the patient monitor may pick a peak pressure in the cuff that is not the real peak. There could be some noise source or something, some extra signal. Could be if the cuff is a cloth covering that you put a bladder into, the bladder will jerk against the cuff as it inflates and as it deflates, so it can cause additional pulsations in the cuff due to that rubbing noise provided by the bladder shifting against the material. So what we want is sometimes we just need to recognize that that peak pressure may be picked incorrectly because of the particular kind of cuff that we're using. Could we shift to a cuff that doesn't have a separate bladder? Yeah, we could do that, and probably you would get a better result, but not always. So we're looking for what's going to be used with this patient monitor for NIBP assessment clinically in each of the clinical units in the hospital for whom we work, or in the client medical facilities that we're traveling to verify the performance of their medical devices. So sometimes if the pressure is picked a little incorrectly, it would be nice to be able to maybe shift that. And remember, we can do that because we're not cheating here. This is not about accuracy. But if we can help the patient monitor pick the right pressure in the cuff, we're much more likely to get a measurement that looks a lot closer to the signals that we're sending into the patient monitor. And we would like for that to happen because while we're looking for repeatability, we're also looking for stability of this measurement system. So it's a lot more that you ought to be thinking about when you're doing these tests in your mind than just hooking up the cuff, hooking up your test instrument, running the dynamic sim, and writing down whatever you write down. All right. You need to be thoughtful about just things like I explained about, say, cuffs with bladders versus cuffs that don't have bladders. Leaky cuffs that have been stuck with a needle and you can't really see the leak. It's a very slow little leak, and you don't have time to take that cuff and submerge it underwater to see the leak. But you can see that it's not making the measurement quite exactly. These are all things that you assess during the repeatability part of the test. All right, so once we've got down the basic way of doing the testing, the accuracy testing with static pressure versus the dynamic simulation for repeatability, now we want to talk about how can we reduce sources of human error in our workflow about NIBP testing. And so there's a couple of ways that you can look at this. Some test instruments these days that are designed for testing non-invasive blood pressure and invasive blood pressure provide a kind of an onboard automation. Well, what's being automated here? What's automated is configuring the test instrument for the measurement that we want to make and automatically collecting the measurement value and perhaps even assessing it against the pass-fail criteria that are established in the manufacturer's service manual test procedure. We could make that a little bit more automatic than you having to push buttons on the front panel. That's called onboard automation. It's a form of automating the test and reducing human error in the workflow. Also, if you're recording manually or writing down on paper and then going back to complete your work assignment in your database, in your CMMS, computerized maintenance management software on your computer, there's a whole lot of sources of human error there that we can eliminate by creating this a little bit more automated workflow and automatically collecting the measurement values and perhaps even assessing them for pass-fail. Another way to do it is by being able to interoperate our test instrument with a software that is a complete workflow. So not just about the NIBP portion of the test, but about everything about that medical device, because typically NIBP is not standalone anymore. It's always going to be in a device that has more than one vital sign parameter that needs to be determined and assessed. And also you have electrical safety that you need to perform as well, along with your visual inspections and any replacement of consumables that you're going to do in the process of doing your evaluation. We call this workflow automation software, and interoperability means the software tells the test instrument how to configure itself for the test we want to do and automatically collects the measured values. The predetermined pass or fail criteria are built into the workflow, so it's automatically in there. But you're still going to interoperate, you're still going to interact with the medical device to set up the measurement that needs to be made. So you're going to push the button to start the NIBP, for example. So you're not hands-free here, but you are eliminating sources of human error. And with the software workflow automation, you get just one test report that covers everything. And then that can be used to even append as a PDF document to your work assignment as you close it in the CMMS. So you can get much more efficient here. There are levels of efficiency you can approach and address. And all of this works together to give you a better probability of passing your next audit about, are you doing what you said you were going to do in your medical device quality assurance program policy? All right, so that all goes into all of this. Keeping your test instruments calibrated is part of it, an important part of it. And that's really what I wanted to share with you about testing performance in NIBP devices. So now it's time for a little Q&A. Linda, can you help me?
I certainly can. Jerry, yeah, we've had a few questions. I will start off with one. How is testing different for inflationary NIBP?
So it's really not. The problem with inflationary NIBP is the test instruments dynamic simulations have not caught up with, and it sounds silly because inflationary NIBP has been around for a little while, but it's more prevalent day by day. Now it's used more and more and more. And so the dynamic simulation could be problematic, but the real deal here is mostly about accuracy, and accuracy, even of inflationary NIBP, is exactly the same as anything else. It's always about static pressure assessments, and that's done in the service calibration mode for NIBP in that device. It's always done the same way. So there's not any difference.
Okie dokie. Another question here is, what is OIML?
So OIML is, and again, it's going to be out of order because OIML is the shorthand for the French name. It's the International Order of Legal Metrology. International Order of Legal Metrology, OIML.
Okie dokie. So another question here is, why must the NIBP device under test be placed in the service mode in order to determine accuracy?
Because you cannot seal the pressure relief valve, you can't close it without being in the service mode. Its normal condition is open to protect the patient, So you have to be able to close that relief valve, and the only way you can do that is in that service mode.
Okay, I've got a few questions about blood pressure. So from the same attendee, he says, what about lower than normal blood pressure?
Well, so low versus high, lower versus higher, kind of depends on things that are not included in the scenario. We need a scenario here. There's more to it than just, is it in a low or a high range? Some people walk around all day with a lower than 120/80 blood pressure, and they do just fine. They're healthy, they're normal, everything works. Other people have trouble with a lower than normal blood pressure, and it's all dependent on who it is, what other underlying disease states or chronic conditions they may have, what else is going on with them at the time. Are they well hydrated? Did they drink enough water or liquids during the day, or did they not? Are they dehydrated and dried out? All of those things are things that impact whether a lower or a higher than normal blood pressure, what it's going to do. Okay. So, I mean, that's going to be my response to your question. If you can be a little more specific, that might help.
Okay, another one here is, that's following on with the blood pressure. Why do we test pressure in PSI and not in mmHg?
So the unit of measure that we use for pressure measurement, it depends on what is the pressure and how is it produced and why are we making the measurement. In medicine, in clinical use, the units of measure are typically either millimeters of mercury or kilopascal, one or the other. They're typically not any other unit of measure, though there are many other units of pressure that we could use. Millibar, for example, could be used, but it's not. In the clinical practice, it's either millimeters of mercury or it's going to be kilopascals, one or the other. And to a huge extent, more than you'd want to know, even though millimeters of mercury are an imperial unit, kilopascals are the SI unit of measure. So if we were going to really be true to metrology in clinical practice, we would use kilopascals. But it is, what is the common use? And so in blood pressure, it's millimeters of mercury or kilopascals.
Okay, that's great. And another question here is, what about for neonatal NIBP?
Oh, what are the range of values? Oh, I didn't get those and I don't remember what they are, but you can quickly look those up. Do a Google search on neonatal blood pressure values or normal blood pressure in neonates, and you should be able to pop it up really, really quickly with no trouble. I'm not sure.
Okie dokie. Another question here is ASCU versus OSC from a psychological perspective. If you wanted accuracy, obtaining blood pressure, regardless of limb used, which method should be used?
Well, it depends. You mean between auscultated pressure and oscillometric? That depends on what you have to do as a clinician. So if I'm an anesthesiologist, I have to manage the airway of the patient. I have to make sure of their oxygenation levels. I have to be sure, which includes their peripheral, an estimate of their peripheral gas exchange, which is going to be partly assessed by pulse oximetry. I want my hands free to do some other things. So I'm going to use an automatic measurement device. Whether it's inflationary or deflationary really doesn't matter. I'm going to use a device. I need to be able to trust its accuracy. If I'm if I am able to use an auscultatory pressure, like sometimes the doctor's nurse will do that when you go into your doctor's office. Sometimes the nurse, while you're in the hospital, will auscultate your blood pressure measurement. Why? Because they have devoted the amount of time, they've allocated that time to be able to make that assessment, and they don't need their hands free to do something else. So it's really kind of determined by the situation in which we need to make the measurement. They can all be accurate, in terms of the way the measurement is made, but it's on us, biomedical engineers and technicians around the world, to ensure that the measurement device, whether it's the analog gauge, the mercury column, or the oscillometric automated technology, is safe and effective for clinical use. That's our job. And the way that we do that is prescribed, and that's why we're doing the training here.
Okay. Another question here is that we have a doctor who's complaining about the accuracy of the device. How can I prove to him that the device is accurate?
Okay, if you're sure that it's accurate, in other words, you have taken his complaint at face value and you've done a static pressure comparison to make sure that device is accurate and you're confident that it is, then the next thing is to invite that doctor to listen on the limb that the cuff is placed on while the oscillometric or automated device makes its determination, makes the measurement. And then he can't complain anymore after that, because he's going to agree that within normal clinical use values, it's accurate. That's what's always worked for me, because invariably what he's done is he's done a not apples to apples comparison. He's trying to make a assessment of blood pressure on a different limb, or doing a different measurement after or before the oscillometric device has made its measurement. And that's a different measurement, and it's going to be a different value. He's forgetting everything he learned or she learned about physiology. You can't call to question their remembering or forgetting the physiology, but what you can do is invite them to listen while the oscillometer makes its assessment, and I think the problem goes away.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Jerry. Another question here is, what is metrology? I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Metrology is the science of accuracy, determining accuracy. That's what metrology is. And when you make a measurement as part of testing a medical device, it is a form of calibration. You are making a metrologically important measurement that determines the safety and effectiveness of the medical device. Metrology is critical. If you've never heard that term before, you're hearing it now. Every single test instrument that we use is a transfer standard. Metrologically, it is the boss. And we use it as a comparison because we keep it calibrated and traceable to all the way to the SI units of measure, that transfer standard is accurate. So it's a way to ensure that no matter where we make this measurement of whatever it is, in this case blood pressure, that our accuracy is going to be the same as somebody else that's using the same instruments and keeping them in calibration anywhere else in the world. Metrology is this agreement internationally, more and more countries signing on to this agreement every day. It's not a well, it's an international agreement. Okay, so it's not a treaty, all right, but it is an international agreement, and it is how we make sure that things are the same, that we have the ability to count on and have confidence in measurements all around the world. Without it, we wouldn't have that at all. We'd have chaos. Seriously. Take a look. Again, you can do a Google search on the term metrology, and you'll probably get real confused because it'll be jargon. But as I've described it to you, here's another thing you can do. We do have a webinar that we did that you can find either in TechNation, or you can find it on our website in our independent webinars, called Why Metrology Matters in Medical Device QA. And I really think that would help you greatly to listen through that one. You can find it on our website, or you can look in the archives of the Wednesday webinars and see if, I'm sure we've done it with TechNation at least once.
Yeah, I'm sure you have too. Well, Jerry, we're coming up to our hour. I have received quite a lot of questions, so I will send them to you afterwards. So attendees, Jerry will answer your questions offline. So look out for his emails in future days. So we will wrap up now. So thank you, Jerry, for a really great and very informative webinar. I've certainly learned something today. And thank you again to today's sponsor, Fluke. Just a reminder that the post-webinar survey and certificate process is automated. So the survey link will be included in the follow-up email, which you'll receive in about an hour's time. Once you've completed the survey, you'll be able to download your certificate immediately. If you have any questions, please contact us at webinar@mdpublishing.com. And for more information about all our upcoming webinars and our past ones, please visit our website, webinarwednesday.live. Thank you all again for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your day, stay safe, and we hope to see you next week.